Okay, so Inscribing the Mongol Invasion into History is my title today, and I'm honored to be here. Okay, let's start. In 1242, the people of Eastern Europe acquired first-hand knowledge about the Mongols in their own lands, but within a short time, the news made it to the westernmost edges of Christian Europe. So much so, in fact, that the news were entered into annals and chronicles, resulting in surprisingly accurate accounts of the Mongol invasion far away from the afflicted countries. In the papers by Attila Bárány and Matthew Coulter yesterday, we have heard a lot about how information was passed on across Central and Western Europe. Today, I will talk about one of the most important chronicles that contains monuments of this busy correspondence, written by Matthew Paris and his team, cloistered monks of the Benedictine monastery of St. Albans. I will focus primarily on the way in which the Mongol news were inscribed into their chronicle, how news became history. Besides understanding what and how was recorded for posterity, I believe that examining the narrative structure and the text's layers can tell us a great deal about Matthew's sources, agenda, and various phases of receiving information. And I argue that this, in turn, is important for our knowledge of the Mongol invasion itself. First, I will describe some narrative tools that Matthew used to weave the Mongol story into the fabric of his linear chronological narrative. Then I will cite a couple of examples to show these techniques in action, and as a side note, identify eminent European prelates whose intellectual political network of information seems to have been the underlying force behind some of Matthew's news acquisition. Finally, I will very briefly address the afterlife of the Mongol story in the Chronica Majora. The story of the Mongol invasion in Eastern Europe is wrought out of narrative accounts, authentic letters, and even memorable illustrations, forming a distinctive narrative. As one of the recurrent threads in the chronicle, the story unfolds in entries revisiting the Mongol situation between 1238 and 1257. Stringing these pieces of text together, the Mongol story unfolds in three waves. Starting with sporadic episodes foreshadowing the Tatar ravages in Europe, the Mongols first appear in the east and the north from 1237 onwards. In the second phase, the Mongol story in the main text peaks with the most frequent entries inserted until under 1241, nothing in 1242, and some more in 1243. Then Matthew gradually relocates the Mongol presence to the Holy Land in the third phase between the years 1244 and 57. The letters and narrative under 1241 are well known. We've heard many quotations from these in Attila Bárány's papers yesterday. For these and the Aditamenta, Matthew seemed to have relied on the kind of correspondence found in the Otto collection of letters that Matthew Coulter presented yesterday. The entries before and after the cataclysm, however, show different concerns about the Mongols, which suggests different networks of information. Both the early and the later Mongol entries seem to be closely associated with European prelates, cardinals, and legates, the engines behind Christendom's, well, actually the Pope's domestic and foreign policy at the time. We've heard yesterday that at the actual time of the Troubles, neither the Pope nor the Emperor seem to have treated the Mongol problem in Eastern Europe as a priority. Indeed, the hub for relaying the Mongol-related information to St. Albans and elsewhere turned to the issue only a couple of years after the Mongols left Central Europe. This hub was the Pope's court, where the information exchange in this field peaked before and during the First Council of Lyon in 1245. As opposed to the 1241 entries concerned with military defense, ravaging, and even crusade preparations, those inserted before and after the cataclysm placed the military threat on the eastern ends of Christianity in a different context: dissent, heterodoxy, and conversion. These are the entries I will now examine a little closer to demonstrate the technicalities of turning news into history and their importance for our research today. I would like to pick out two thoughts from Matthew's paper yesterday. On the one hand, he noted that the Otto letter collection is also a piece of monastic history writing in which meaning is imparted through the conscious arrangement of material. On the other hand, he also mentioned that Matthew Paris interspersed the letters that he recorded with his own commentary. Conscious arrangement is even more important in the Chronica Majora's narrative, which is created from received material already carrying intrinsic bias. His efforts to consciously rearrange and add his own commentary comprise an additional editorial layer to reckon with in the study of the original letters preserved in his chronicle. He uses two distinct, albeit often overlapping, sequencing techniques, embedding and alternation, deployed at every structural level of his chronicle. On the level of individual entries, Matthew uses embedding in single entries to enhance the depth of his narrative. Passages in his own voice introduce and conclude those by illustrious guest performers, ranging from powerful Saracens, noblemen's correspondence, and private exchanges of the crowned heads of Europe. This is true for most reported entries throughout the chronicle, including the letter that contains the first fleeting reference to the Mongols in 1237. In a brief preface, Matthew explains that Brother Godfrey, the papal penitentiary, had distributed copies of a letter to the Dominicans in France and England, having himself received it from a brother Philip. It is noteworthy that Godfrey's letter also refers to previous missives sent to him by a William of Montferrat. I have no time to present more of them, so you just have to believe me that most of the Mongol material that is presented in the form of authentic letters is inscribed into chronicle entries in this complicated, many-layered form. Throughout the entire Chronica Majora, alternating episodes of 2, sometimes 3 subplots is a technique Matthew used to weave parallel histories into a linear narrative. Unstitching the alternating strands also reveals a great deal about the networks behind the information. Here, for example, the first ever mention of the Mongols is hidden in this complex, go back. In this complex letter, that in turn is part of a series of entries about the Holy Land. As can be seen in this very schematic color-coded chart, this section of the chronicle is woven out of episodes about Frederick II, English events, and intelligence from the Holy Land and beyond, in purple, blue, orange, respectively. These rhythmically alternate as the chronicle progresses. Following Emperor Frederick's rejected invitation to an assembly, which is blue, Matthew continues with local news from the English countryside and the arrival of Legate Otto in England, which is purple. Then he cites the letter of Godfrey and ultimately Friar Philip to the Pope, which is orange. It is notable that the Dominican letter from the Holy Land itself is essentially about the conversion of the patriarchs of Jerusalem, and it goes hand in hand with the subsequent entry about the Nestorians' era. After the sequence about the Eastern heresies, Matthew returns to domestic affairs and Legate Otto, purple, then back to the Templars and the Hospitallers in the Holy Land, orange, then Frederick again, then Otto in England again, and so on. Who is this Legate Otto, for example? Considering the relative dearth of information elsewhere, it is surprising how much Matthew knows about this person, Otto of Montferrat, a cardinal deacon. Between 1237 and 40, he was the papal legate in England, Scotland, and Ireland, but his figure looms large in the chronicle even after he had left the country. He was extremely well connected in the continent. On his way back to Rome in 1241, for example, he was captured by imperial forces in the Battle of Gillio, together with Cardinal James of Pecorari, an old acquaintance with whom he'd been on various other missions before. It is notable that James came to Hungary as Pope Gregory IX's legate in the early 1200s, together with Master Roger, Bishop of Oradea. In fact, Roger dedicated to him the well-known Carmen Miserabile, one of the most important surviving narratives about the Mongol invasion. But what happens when Legate Otto crops up in the Chronica Majora? Well, it seems that quite often Mongol-related material happens, or rather the other way around. Mongol entries are often close to notes about Legate Otto. His connections can be detected both in embedded material and by examining the context of letters by others recorded in the proximity of his exploits. For example, it is highly probable that the William of Montferrat, cited in Philip's letter, was related to the large and powerful Montferrat family and the kin of Legate Otto. As for alternating Otto's entries with Mongol-related issues, here the episodes concerning the legate and the foreign-friendly English king alternate neatly with news from the Holy Land, in which the Mongol threat is no more than a passing detail. The connections to Mongol material are less tenuous in entries after 1241. For example, Matthew notes briefly at the bottom of the first column on folio 166 that Otto was made Bishop of Portugal in 1243. I don't know why this is not doing what I want to do. Oh, there you go. There it is, with the little mitre. At the top of the next column on the same page begins one of the best known and most puzzling Mongol-related documents in the Chronica Majora, yet another example of a letter embedded in another letter, and then some. It is by a man called Ivo of Narbonne, writing to Gerald, Bishop of Bordeaux. I'm not going to address the contents of Ivo's letter here, as Stephen talked about the events described in it in greater detail yesterday, but it's pertinent that his letter is also one of those Matryoshka dolls that contain another account, this time by a man even more of an outcast and a drifter than himself, an Englishman in the service of the Khan, who not only describes the Mongols, but also embarks on his own story embedded in Ivo's. At the end, his account trails off and continues seamlessly with an acerbic criticism of the idleness and discord prevailing in the English church, which, though unremarked, is certainly not originally part of the Englishman's story. Once again, the letter makes more sense in the context of the alternating strands that it is stuck into. Quite out of chronology, being the only Mongol entry inserted until 1243, this letter is found in the middle of a subplot tracing the progress of the enmity between Pope and Emperor. The entries preceding the letter detail the treachery and desertion of Frederick's allies, among others Henry Raspe and the Marquis of Montferrato, who is none other than the brother of Legate Otto. Although it does seem to be a letter primarily about the Mongols in Eastern Europe, I wouldn't say it's a purely Mongol-related document, despite all the Tatars in it. Though irresistibly gory, and for once featuring some English connection, the Mongol story is but one of the many examples of godlessness collected in one graphic, picaresque novella. Conspicuous themes of dissent emerge in the letter, and the other one embedded in it, namely Catharism and the rise of the Begin movement, as well as the controversies of the expansion of the preachers and minorites and general discord within the very bosom of the church. Tracking the possible journey of the entry from the addressee of the letter, Bishop Gerald, Peter Zegel suggests that Matthew Paris's source in England was none other than Henry III of England. However, if we amplify the message and the themes addressed in the letter, it will be rather straightforward that this is not the kind of letter that a bishop would give the English king to disseminate in his realm. Rather, the themes in it are resonant of ecclesiastical anxieties circulating at the time. It is the kind of letter that would be used to learn and preach about and respond to various forms of internal dissent and external threats that the church was facing. In fact, it illustrates with first-hand accounts nearly all the so-called pains that the church was expressly dealing with in the 1240s. As with many other letters in this portion of the chronicle, the material probably came the long way around. As noted previously, the entries under 1243 and 45 confirm that Matthew's account under these years was informed by letters and other texts brought from Lyon, specifically the council held in 1245, which expressly made the 5 pains of the church its agenda. Similar to Christ's 5 wounds, the church was suffering from pains that had been increasingly in the forefront of the dogmatic thinking of the age, which in turn very much affected the foreign policy of both the Pope and the secular leaders waging wars on various fronts. How do we know that the Pope's court in Lyon was informed and maybe the mediator of these texts? Well, the Bishop of Bordeaux was actually in Lyon in 1245, working on the deposition of Frederick II on account of heresy, sacrilege, and other crimes. The aforementioned Otto of Montferrato was also there, as the Pope entrusted him with the task of dealing with the umiliati, the Cathars, as an auditor. The letter about such abundant and varied cases of heterodoxy as Ivo of Narbonne's was an extremely valuable piece of evidence in their line of work, let alone its other subject, which covered at length one of the other pressing issues on the Council's agenda, the Mongols. They also knew each other pretty well. Okay, sorry. Otto is featured squeezed right next to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, the addressee of Ivo of Narbonne's letter in Matthew's illustration of the aforementioned captures of cardinals and bishops. And let's not forget James of Pecoraro, also in the boat. His old familiar, Master Roger, is also thought to have been in attendance at the Lyon Council. I don't have time to go into detail about the English leg of the journey of all their information, but the main suspect who may have relayed much of it to St. Albans is Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, who also was in attendance at the council and remained in the court for some time, even afterwards. As noted, besides the Mongols in Austria and the Cathars in Lombardy, both this letter and another entry further down in the alternating storylines also contain information about the Beguines, which ultimately points to concerns of the Lyon Council, but may go back to other information networks besides the legates. For example, Cologne was a hotbed of one branch of Catharism, as well as the Beguines, not to mention the previously chastised Norbertines at the time, but the evidence once again points to Lyon's role of mediating this info. As Attila mentioned yesterday, the real holders of royal authority in Northwest Germany were the imperial electors, Konrad of Hochstaden, Archbishop of Cologne, and the Archbishop Sigrid of Mainz. Of all people, they were also visiting in Innocent IV's new court in Lyon right before the Pope announced the call for the council. Their mission was to convince the Pope, if he was still in doubt, to excommunicate Frederick II for the second time and to depose him. In any case, whether genuine or not, the Frenchman's story about Catharism, Beguines, and Mongols, primarily used to emphasize themes of discord within the church, are brought together to connect questions of heterodoxy and dissent on a number of levels, which mirror the Lyon agenda. Now that I covered at least some interesting point about the way in which contemporary and not so contemporary news were written up into historiography, I would like to devote the last few minutes of my paper to another dimension of the Chronicle, its afterlife as a primary source. The Chronica Majora is in fact a continuation of an earlier work, Roger of Wendover's Flores Historiarum, itself made up of the interwoven narratives of earlier chroniclers, for example, Robert of Torigny and Sigebert of Gembloux. In turn, it was later similarly reused, redacted, and continued. Its first and most prolific redactor was Matthew Paris himself, picking the flowers of history out of the massive monolith of his Chronica Majora. His Flores Historiarum was created for wide circulation and thus written along very different principles than the larger chronicle. It is perhaps germane here that already in the Chronica Majora, some of the Mongol and other international entries were marked up as irrelevant for English history. Oops. As a result, the Chronica Majora's sweeping story of a very active Mongol military campaign in mostly identifiable European locations was reduced in the Flores to short passages with no geographical references to Eastern Europe. So this is the version of the St. Albans Chronicles that was used in later continuations and chronicles in England, such as those by Adam Morimuth or Nicholas Trivet. The Flores flourished for a long, long time before its significance waned, and the Mongol story was nearly completely silent in it. Where was the Chronica Majora all this time? After the 14th century, English historiography was for centuries largely reliant on other works, such as Higden's Polychronicon, while older perennial favorites such as Bede, Henry of Huntington, and William of Malmesbury were still in use to some extent. The Chronica Majora fell into complete disuse by the 16th century. After some lurking in the dark, it was Matthew's pronounced anti-papal rhetoric that 16th century apologists of the Reformation discovered and adopted to their purposes. As was noted about Ivo's letter, Matthew often merged various sources and flattened them into a narrative in his own chronicle, skillfully making his version of individual utterances and correspondence into a historia proper. This flattening was further enhanced by these additions in the 17th century, which often obliterated the last remaining marked boundaries between received sources and the commentary of the historian. This trend was turned around in the 17th century, when the Chronica Majora's Latin text, the text was republished with minor changes by William Watts. This remained the definitive edition until Lourd's transcription for the 19th century roll series and Felix Liebermann's critical edition in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica. Thanks to these and subsequent collections, today the Chronica Majora is one of the go-to primary sources about the Mongol invasion in Europe and their presence in the Holy Land. Though they made Matthew's Mongol story truly accessible for researchers, with most of its layers and complexities visible again, it is still rewarding to go back to the manuscript and unpack the complexity of the text that Matthew created out of received material. The Chronica Majora cannot be seen as a discrete, self-contained text. It's an accumulating work, a stage in a continuous tradition of various narratives. To put it into perspective, any one of us here, using his text as a primary source, citing his passages in our respective articles and books, essentially repeat what Matthew did back in the 13th century. This is precisely why it is important to see how and why the Mongol entries were appropriated and adopted in Matthew Paris's historical project when we reach for the trusty text of the Roll series, or source readers reproducing bits of Matthew's Mongol history in serially mediated, interpreted, translated, cited, and re-edited versions. And I'm on target. Thank you very much.